This is part two of my conversation with Seth Radwell, the author of American Schism: How the Two Enlightenments Hold the Secret to Healing Our Nation, which will be linked in the description below. We talked last episode about our nation's current political divide and the two differing versions of the Enlightenment. And today, we will analyze how these two different visions have permeated throughout American history. Enjoy the episode. So, last time we left off talking about the two different versions coming out of the Enlightenment: the Moderate Enlightenment and the Radical Enlightenment. And the Radical Enlightenment philosophers believed in open democracy, and the moderates kind of feared democracy because they feared mob rule and they feared that uneducated masses would have a voice, and they didn't like that. They were more in favor of the aristocratic model. So I want to focus in, which I think is the biggest societal challenge or hurdle that underlines all of this, which is public education and the importance of a knowledgeable citizenry. If you look at Eisenhower's farewell address, I know he was talking about the military industrial complex, but he said the best anecdote is an alert and knowledgeable citizenry, which I think is very important, not just about the military industrial complex, but about everything. So, what is the importance of an educated citizenry in democracy?
It's fundamental. It's a great point that you bring up, and in fact, the radicals, especially, or the kind of the democratic enlighteners, they believe that common people, even though so many were uneducated in their day, could be educated in civic affairs in a way that would allow citizens to pick representatives, to argue for their interests, to promote their interests. So the Democratic Republican types, Jefferson and Franklin and Thomas Paine, they very much understood the importance of what today would be called the civic education. I think the moderates weren't against education by any means, but since their model was more where educated leaders, aristocrats, what we call elite today, that they would be governing on behalf of the people, I think they were not as vociferously for broad-based education. Now, this is actually reflected in the work that many of the enlighteners did. For example, during the French Enlightenment and during the first part of the French Revolution, Condorcet, who was a very influential philosopher and what I would call part of the Radical Enlightenment, he articulated an entire slate of educational material that the state should provide. Now, in Europe, he was reacting to the fact that he had documented that for many centuries, the church, which really controlled education, and the monarchy colluded to keep the people oppressed. So he was trying to break education away from the purview of only the church. He wasn't against church teaching, but he wanted to make sure it was rounded out with enlightenment-based teaching. And so so he really established, Condorcet did, that the foundational requirements for what a civic education might include. And I think in the U.S. we had a similar angle, if you will. Someone like Benjamin Franklin, one of the great enlighteners on the radical side. I mean, his whole life was about distributing information, the printing press, Paul Richard's Almanac. He was very enthused about the notion of educating the common person. So there are definitely educational aspects of the Enlightenment that are so important.
Yeah, and fast forwarding to today, how do we strive for a better and objective education in a world with increasing ideological driven mainstream narratives? There's a lot of misinformation on social media because social media is such a huge aspect of today's, life, that a lot of people get the vast amount of their information from social media, which can be riddled with all kinds of false narratives. So how do we navigate that sort of public and civic education in today's world?
Well, you bring up a great example with social media. The idea that so many people today, and especially young people, read something or see something on social media and believe it to be true is exactly the problem itself. In critical thinking, in what when we talk about civic education, that I think we've taken our foot off the gas pedal. We've really been lax in recent generations. The whole concept is to be able to evaluate sources for veracity and to check different sources to really understand and pursue the truth and then make an argument, a logical argument based on sources. So that is a fundamental part of critical thinking, which is a vital part of civic education. You know, Jacob, when you're much younger than I, but when I was in school, even in high school, we used to have debate clubs where the whole concept was to take to really do research and create an argument for a point of view and then debate it. And maybe the next week you actually were assigned to do the opposite point of view, and you had to come up with different arguments. So the whole notion of critical thinking is so crucial, and I think today we've lost the importance of that. And too many people rely on social media without checking sources and making sure that the information that they consume is from various sources, is diverse, and also is from quality sources. So that's a very important piece.
Yeah, I love that exercise. Personally, I love doing that. I love putting myself in the shoes of a viewpoint that I disagree with and trying to completely understand it and be able to articulate it from that point of view. Even though I disagree with it, I think it's a fun intellectual exercise and it leads to a more, educated, cohesive conversation around various political issues. But we did talk a little bit about the church. For hundreds of years leading up to the Enlightenment, the church kind of controlled all aspects of life in terms of education, the way you live your life, the rules and laws. And the radicals came along in the Enlightenment and had this radical point of view that they want a clear separation of church and state.
Right. That was the radical enlightenment concept that Jefferson was so taken with.
Exactly. And looking at the founding of America, a lot of people say that in America we have a separation of church and state. A lot of people say that America is built on Judeo-Christian values. How do you draw the line when it comes to the founding of America between those two?
This is a fascinating topic, and I could make an argument that in many respects American history has been this tension, this push and pull between the notion of a civic bottom up forming of America based on uh, natural rights versus a more top down religious oriented one that, as you mentioned, based on Judeo Christianity. And I think there's elements of both. Certainly both have played a role. But if we're fair to history and if we're accurate, most of the founders, as you probably know, were deists. They believed very much in a separation of church and state, and many came from an environment through their ancestors in Britain where religion was very much regulated, if you will, or at least it was very prejudicial. So they really believed in freedom of religion as part of a founding metric for the U.S. for this new country. I think this tension between them is interesting in many respects. I'll give you one interesting example. The the founding period maybe was from the 1770s to 1790s was maybe the most secular period of our history. Soon after, at the turn of the century, there was a movement called the Second Great Awakening, which was very much a religious movement that was very important for many reasons. I mean, it did many wonderful things. For example, it was the first time that women got actively involved in what we would call political issues, because they would go to um, these meetings, these outdoor meetings where they would learn about morality, about what are the great issues of the day. Of course, was slavery, and much of the abolition movement took off through the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, as did things like uh, uh, you know alcohol. I forget the name of the term, but in other words, there were many people who were against drinking and making alcohol
Prohibition?
prohibition. But before, there was another term from the 18th century I can't think of. But yes, it led to prohibition. But there was basically women were complaining that many of their husbands were abusing alcohol and getting violent, and so there was a real movement for prohibition at that point as well. My point being, the Second Great Awakening brought new voices into the discussion, which was very powerful. But at the same time, the Second Great Awakening did recast the founding of America in a bit of a revisionist light. And what I mean by that is, as America became increasingly quite quite religious and devout, there was a famous painting, for example, at that time, which portrayed a picture of God handing the Constitution down to General Washington as tablets. Now, so this is ironic in many respects. Of course, that allusion to the Exodus from Egypt, which is such a strong Judeo-Christian concept, it was really not the thinking behind how the Constitution was formed, which was a bottom-up document of we the people. Furthermore, while the Ten Commandments are set in stone, the Constitution was not supposed to be set in stone. My point being is that at the turn of the century, there was this revisionist view that America was a godly country, that we were kind of a divinely inspired, and I think that notion affected a good part of the 19th century, the early 19th century, and even comes back, of course, in the 20th century. So there's been a pendulum-like swing between these polarities, between the importance of kind of civic ideals from a philosophical perspective, and yet the morality of religious-based concepts grounded in Judeo-Christian religion. One great example I think we can't help but think about is one of our greatest social change leaders, Martin Luther King, was grounded both deeply grounded in religion and spirituality and faith, as well as a very strong moral philosophy. And he married the two. So I'm not saying they're conflicting necessarily. Sometimes they can be reinforcing. But in terms of our model of government, this notion of bottom up of the people versus kind of a top down divine thing, that's where they do conflict a bit, and we've had a lot of push and pull therein.
That's a wonderful aspect of the book that you lace throughout the entire book is this idea of the pendulum swing, which I want to get into later. I want to flesh that out deeper. But speaking of the Second Great Awakening, this kind of came off of the coattails of the Counter-Enlightenment movement, which came off the coattails of the Radical and Moderate Enlightenment movement. So I do want to talk a little bit about this Counter-Enlightenment movement. What exactly was this ideology?
Well, it's very interesting. Counter Enlightenment was not necessarily tied to religion, but it often became so. Let me explain. So, there was a movement following the 18th century, the second half of the 18th century, when the Enlightened movement, again, for your listeners to remind them, the Enlightened movement was this incredible awakening of an interest in reason, science, empirical data, the idea to solve problems using our God-given skills of reasoning and empirical observation to be able to make our lives better. So it was a huge period of let's call it rationality. Sometimes it's called reason.
So sort of like an objectivist point of view.
Yes, absolutely. Now there was a pushback, right away. There was a pushback at the time, which became what in cultures but called the Romantic movement, and you saw it in music, in writing, where many writers and artists push back that viewing the world in such a calculated, scientific, rational way was missing the miracle of humanity. And many of them related that to religion, of course, and faith. So the Counter-Enlightenment movement basically just means that it rejects the Enlightenment. And it does so from various points of view. There was at the time, Edmund Burke, an important philosopher in Britain, he was a Counter-Enlightener, not so much from a religious perspective, but he thought the Counter-Enlightenment and its focus on reason and the individual invariably harmed the idea of community and of working together as a society. So he critiqued the Enlightenment from another perspective. In the US, the Enlightenment was critiqued often based on a Counter-Enlightenment that was driven by faith. In other words, that if we assume that all the answers lie in reason and rationality, we give up the idea that faith and morality is God given, and that was definitely aspect of the Counter Enlightenment. And I think it had both positive and negative effects on American history. I go through this in the book. For example, one of the most amazing things about the importance of faith and Counter Enlightenment movement was the way the U.S. in the U.S., especially this new country, expanded into thousands, hundreds of thousands of community churches all across the country, which became really, in some senses, the civic square. They became important centers of discussion about issues. So, yes, they were grounded in religion and faith, but they also became kind of the center of community in so many parts of America. And notice that they were decentralized, right? These were all in individual communities. So they were a powerful mechanism in a Jeffersonian sense of decentralized government, decentralized discussion. So, in that sense, this counter-enlightenment movement was very positive. On the other hand, I think there were moments when there has been in our history an attempt, and a sometimes successful one, to tie one religion to the state, or give that religion access to leaders in a way that is counter to what our founders wanted. They really wanted a wall between the two. So I think religion has also played a negative role in terms of civic affairs by using its influence inappropriately. And I don't think this is one of those issues, Jacob, that's complex, right? You have to really understand the different sides of it. I think faith. There's no question that faith and religion, whatever persuasion, is a foundational aspect of so many American lives. But in my view, it's always a balance. There has to be a balance between, faith and the the parts of the miracle of human life and our world that are not really explainable, but the parts that are rational and explainable, where we can advance and improve life. So the balance between those is in some ways a balance between kind of an enlightenment perspective and a more counter-enlightenment perspective.
It's such a complicated issue, and I love talking about the impact and the influence of church on society. It's something that I often grapple with, and I love discussing sort of the philosophical aspect of it. I'm a Christian, so that's my belief, but I love talking about the philosophical aspect and its impact on society. I believe that church is very important on a local community level for the reasons you mentioned about it sort of builds community, fosters community, it gives people a common set of values. And there is the negative aspect of it that you did touch on in the book, and that's something I want to get into a little bit later with neoliberalism later on in American history. But sort of a philosophical question for you, and this is one that Dolbach talks a little bit about: is morality and a universal moral code possible without institutions like the church? Is it's such a fascinating question to me. I personally don't think you can have a universal moral code without an institution, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
So this has been a question that's confounded philosophy for quite a long time. In the Enlightenment, there was a great difference of opinion about it. So somebody, just as an example, someone like Dolbach probably, thought that there was a universal code that applied to all human beings, where someone like Voltaire or Montesquieu or some of the moderate enlighteners very much believed that different parts of the world had different, in fact, they often tied it to things like climate, had different needs, and that it wasn't universalist. So just for your listeners, Enlightenment philosophers themselves were very of very various points of view regarding this question. But I think if you look deeply in philosophy, you have a philosopher going back to the early Enlightenment like Spinoza. And Spinoza very much makes a philosophical case for morality being part of a rule. Like, it's almost like rules of nature, where he ties it into what could be like what he called God. So, in other words, the notion of in other words, there's a logical reason. The best logical reason of a moral code that's universal in your language, to make this simple, has to be Kantian. Do unto others as you want them to do unto you. So Kant, Immanuel Kant, famous Enlightenment philosopher, his writing, and he was brilliant, very much argued that there is in fact a non-religious or a non-institutional way of thinking about arriving at a moral code. And his golden rule would be the best example in simple terms. I think there were many. If you look like at C.S. Lewis, or excuse me, Other thinkers and writers over the course of history have argued very differently. So I think this is the jury's out on this one. I certainly believe that we've seen so much violence and horror in the world over its history, and even in our short lives on the planet, that it's hard to argue that whether it's religious institution or some kind of authority, or it's a kind of a bottom up rational based morality, we haven't succeeded at really achieving it in many ways, right? I mean, it's our track record. I mean, you have to also, you can't not notice that many of the bloodiest wars were fought over faiths of religion, the crusade, going back to the Crusades. And even today, I mean, one could make the case, and many have, that there is a clash of civilizations between a more fundamentalist Islamic society and a Judeo-Christian one, and this is playing out in Europe. So there's no question that religion, on one hand, has been a fundamental purveyor of morality, yes, as an institution, but it's also caused a lot of violence. So it's to your point, it's not an easy question, and I wonder about this as well. I think, though, for your listeners, you can definitely find philosophers that try to tie it together. The best two examples would be, I think, Kant and Spinoza, which definitely made the case for both a rational view of morality, why it made sense for individuals, in order to be in a social contract, to operate morally, as well as a faith-based case.
And it goes back to that pendulum swinging, that over history there's sort of this push and pull between religious institutions and sort of that ground up um, democratic view of morality, I guess, is a decent way to put it.
I mean, at the end of the day, you mentioned you being a Christian. I mean, to me, when you look at the teachings of Christ, and going back to the Sermon on the Mount, in this religious tradition, there's nothing as moral as what the teachings of Christ were. They were extremely, by almost any definition, they were kind of a moral code. Wouldn't you agree? And I guess many religions have that, but all religions that have that are often, there's a lot of hypocrisy in terms of how they implement stuff today, right? They don't always follow the real teachings of for example, Christ, or even in the Quran. I'm not an expert, but there's been a lot of discussion about how the elements of the Quran have been misused and misinterpreted, etc.
It's such a fascinating conversation. I mean, anything where even these brilliant minds, these philosophers throughout history have grappled with these ideas and debated these ideas. It's just permeated throughout all of history. It's such a fascinating discussion. I want to talk about the Civil War because when I hear people today saying that we're the most politically divided we've ever been and it's dire, I kind of I definitely don't buy into that because in my mind I'm thinking, at some point in our history we literally fought a civil war because we were so divided. And obviously we're not fighting a civil war today, so I'm sure it can't be as bad as it was then. Can you trace the causes of the Civil War to these two differing Enlightenment views?
Yes, I think it definitely is related, but not maybe in a way that that is so obvious. Let me try to explain. I mean, the great contradiction of the American founding was in our credo, the Declaration of Independence. There there is the foundational presumption is that all are created equal. And I've made the point, as have other Jeffersonians, that he wasn't actually only talking about white men. I mean, it was really all humanity. And of course, the contradiction was we were a society that, at least in parts, embraced slavery, and going back, many parts of the country did. I think most of our founders recognized that the contradiction, and that slavery was not an institution that could survive were we to promulgate the meaning of the Declaration. But for political reasons and for compromise, they avoided it in the constitutional blueprint. And some would say, "What a horrible thing." Others might say, "If we hadn't done that, we never would have created a country." So I view it. I view the compromises that were made in forming the Constitution as fundamental to a process by which you move forward. Because had we not gotten there, we wouldn't have had a country. Now, I think what exploded in the Civil War was the realization of this contradiction in our values, but at the same time, the economic pressures and in a good part of our country that where the economy was entirely dependent on the institution, and where the North was increasingly gaining power through its industrial might. And so the reason why how it applies to the two views of the Enlightenment was the Jeffersonian decentralized view would probably argue that the South had the right to secede, that based on their belief that the founding premises, and I could argue that that's a flawed analysis, because the founding premises talked about equality, but still the notion of the Constitution following in the wake of the Declaration was that when a government is not meeting the needs of its people, and the people can present grievances and document them, which of course was the model of the Declaration, then they have the right to form their own government. So one could make the argument, I think, and I think some have, that the the radical Enlightenment view might have supported the secession of the southern states. I think what the brilliance of Lincoln was, he interpreted, first of all, he thought that in some ways the Constitution was subordinate to the Declaration. That in other words, the Declaration was the credo, the mission, if you will, and the Constitution was its blueprint, how to get there. But as he famously said, we have work to do. We're not, we have to amend the Constitution as our founders wanted to continue to better our society. So he viewed the mission of establishing the America as an ongoing work that started with the Declaration, but was still happening. And the idea of abolishing slavery, I think, was a part of an arc, which according to progressives they would call it the arc of progress, right? Over time. But there's no question in your point is valid. Is that in terms of division, I don't think we were ever more divided. In fact, one of the things that I write often about is it's not so much whether we're divided or not; it's how we deal with it. And in the Civil War, the way we dealt with it was, of course, quite horribly, with quite a lot of violence. One of the reasons I promote so often the idea of more productive dialogue between the left and the right, or between the red and blue America, whatever you want to call it, is that I think we have to recognize that we're not the enemy. We have to talk to each other. And try not to get to a point where it's violent, where that's the goal, is to avoid that. And one of the failures in my mind of political leaders in the last 30 years, both left and right, is this willingness to demonize their opponents as if like they're bad people. When people disagree on on issues that are fair, and 70 million people can't be bad. And that, have the man voted for Trump or the man voted for Biden. They're both around 75 million. I mean, so the point is that people can disagree about issues, and how can they disagree productively so that we move towards solution? I think the failure in elected politics of our time, and the failure that your generation is going to increasingly have to grapple with, is if we continue to use tactics that make us seem like enemies, as opposed to trying to find ways to bridge us and pull us together. In my mind, it may win a short-term battle, but it's a losing proposition.
100%. And that goes back to the personality over policy debate and the tribal politics that we talked about last episode. But that's such an interesting point you make about there's a case to be made that secession was actually a testament to radical Enlightenment ideals, even though it may be a flawed argument. And I did an episode with a professor named Joshua Morrow a while back, and we talked about why did the South secede, and we really fleshed that out. And one of the questions I asked was, America at its founding technically seceded from the British monarchy, and that was the Declaration of Independence. So isn't there a case to be made that the South had a right to do that if our nation did it in the first place?
Well, you have to be careful here. This is a great question. After in the early years of the country, there were two very famous rebellions where citizens tried to secede again. The first was Shays Rebellion. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Shays Rebellion, during the Revolutionary War, many of the farmers who fought, and many gave their lives, in fact, really stood up. Shay was a farmer in Massachusetts who fought in the war. And what happened was in the 1780, late 80s, in order to resolve the debt problem, to pay for the war, Hamilton, of course, his plan involved a financial solution which created a lot of debt. And the ones holding the debt and getting hurt were often common citizens like Shay and his fellow farmers, because their prices went way up. I mean, economically, it worked against their favor, and they were outraged. Now, so they basically said, we have grievances, like did our forebears in 1776, and we are going to rebel against the government of Massachusetts in this case. And it happened again later with the Whiskey Rebellion for taxes on whiskey. Now, at the time, George Washington, our president, was very specific about delineating that in the earlier cases, 1776, that the grievances so documented were so extensive and so beyond the notion of any resolution, because the colonists had no voice, that's what justified a revolution. Whereas in the latter two cases, Shay and his counterparts, as well as in the Whiskey Rebellion, these were citizens who had a voice, right? They may have been outvoted, but they were in the process. So Washington, I think, would have said, in order to justify, and this is so fascinating because of course we could talk about January 6th, right? Was that a fair rebellion, or was it? I think I looked at this from many sides. I think Washington, in his argument, and the Federalists of the time would have said that both the Whiskey Rebellion and Shays Rebellion needed to be put down, as I would think they would say about January 6th, because these are people who are involved in the process, and they're, as much as some of our politicians want to say things are stolen and it's corrupt, that there's no documented evidence that's the case. So the point being is that we do have a democratic process that we have to live by, and it doesn't mean in that process that you get what you want all the time. Sometimes you lose the vote, and that doesn't, losing the vote or getting outvoted does not justify armed rebellion.
That's a fascinating discussion to be had. Do these people have a right to rebel, or are they wrong? Because, like you said, these are people who are actually contributing in the democratic process.
Well, they have a right to rebel. So let me be clear. They absolutely have a right to protest. And if they don't like the outcome of legislation, they can present ideas, they can scream, they can yell. They can't kill people. I mean, this is where violence is protest is a wonderful tradition in our country. I mean, and it's been part of so many movements. So the notion of making your voice heard outside of just the voting booth, through organization, through assembly, through protesting, all of that is very much sanctioned by the American process and tradition. I think it's when is armed rebellion justified, and I think the circumstances are very narrow. But in the Civil War, obviously, the South thought the circumstances applied.
Yeah, let's be quite clear. Violence is never the answer. But I want to get a little juicier here. Let's get into the nitty gritty. There's someone who you are quite critical of in your book. You spend a lot of time criticizing him. What do you think about Donald Trump?
So originally, I was quite taken with Donald Trump's both skills as a communicator and much of his policy. And I was very open, even though I was a little concerned by his tactics and his antics, if you will, about, in retrospect, I wish he had embraced all of America after he originally won. But I think, over the course of time, his continued use of divisiveness became a liability for America, even though I think he was, his policy towards China, for example, even he was right about the carnage in America. I mean, I think industrialization, neoliberalism as an economic policy hurt much of America. So the elite establishment was not meeting the needs of Americans. He was right about so much, but I become very critical because of the continued use of divisiveness as the tool, which in so many ways is very close to how dictators have used it over time, the tools that he used. But then also, for me, the call to violence on January 6th was the turning point. I mean, I think at that point I couldn't really support Trumpism the way it was defined, and I think I would have called myself kind of a center right, Republican of the old school. But I'm one, I guess, like Liz Cheney or Adam Kinzinger, that believes that the Republican Party, the way they've fallen in line behind what Trump has done, has been very damaging to our country.
Hmm. He sort of utilized, one of the tools you mentioned. He utilized populism, which is another thing you talk a lot about in the book. So, what exactly is populism, and how did Trump utilize that to garner popularity and win in 2016?
Yeah, so popularism is a fascinating concept in and of itself. What popularism really is originally defined as is a movement of the people bottom up when the ruling elite are not accounting for their needs. So let's go through some history. The first populist movement was Jacksonian, because at the time the Federalists were becoming more and more disconnected from the concerns of average Americans back in the let's say in the 19th century, in the early 19th century. So there was a huge populist movement which really was bottom up, and one could argue that Jackson became a symbol of it top down, but it was very much part of the ethos of the period. Let's go to another time. Let's go to the 1890s. In this period of time, there was increasingly an establishment made that was very powerful, increasingly powerful, made up of railroads, steel, and oil, and the kind of the so-called barons of the era of what we sometimes call the Gilded Age. At the time, because so many farmers were getting hurt badly, a bottom-up movement called the Farmers Alliance began to spring up to teach farmers how to um, cooperatively buy together, how to band together to have more power economically. And the Farmers Alliance was in many ways a wonderful movement because it was educational. It taught people that were disenfranchised how much power they could have by engaging themselves, by being part of the political process. And of course, the Farmers Alliance led to the People's Party, and the party itself didn't sustain. But I argue in the book that the era of those years of that movement, of that bottom-up movement, led to the progressive era, 20 years later, from both sides of the aisle, whether it was Wilson or Teddy Roosevelt. So yes, that bottom-up movement of populism has been very positive in American history. Now, let's fast forward to today. Popularism is also sometimes referred to the idea of elites themselves using arguments to curry favor and push buttons of people to get them angry and afraid, and using populist or nationalist themes to mobilize voters. And that's the political use of what I would call is the misuse of populism. But that is also is now one could argue, what did Trump do? I think he started out with the former. He was recognizing and giving voice to so many Americans that were left behind. Um, you know, I think one could also make the case that he was very much a manipulator populist who used populist arguments to scare people, especially around immigration. I think his use of religion many times. So, I think you could make both cases. From my analysis, even if he started out being um, a popularist leader who, even though elite himself, was trying to give voice to Americans that had less of a voice, I think that was valid. I think he showed over time that he was much more willing to become the populist of a demagogue, the other kind of populist, which I think was intent on staying in power by using tools of the demagogue. And so, this is what a lot of people in the MAGA camp say I'm a never Trumper. And I really believe I have, in my mind, a rational view of this that's based on, I think, behaviors and actions that I think are pretty clear. I don't think that Trump supporters are bad people, But I do think that the way that they've given their devotion to cult does feel to me like cult-like. To Trump feels cult-like, and that bothers me.
To sort of push back on that, the moderate Enlightenment philosophers and pioneers, they criticize open democracy because of fear of demagogues who could exploit those emotions and stoke those passions.
Absolutely. I mean, let's. I mean, from that perspective, let's be very clear. The moderate enlighteners were very afraid of someone like Trump because they wanted the elite to rule. I mean, here's the thing with populism. It's to me, and it's an important aspect of our political landscape in that a populist movement tells the rulers, the elite class who's ruling, that something is wrong, that people are not being that the government is not working for people. Now, it's up to the rulers, the elite rulers, either or new ones that get elected, to fix that. And I think we got to where we are because for 50 years, or at least 40 years, elites of both the Republican Party and the Democrat, whether it's Mitt Romney's takers or Hillary Clinton's deplorables, the elites of both parties showed tremendous disdain for the voices of popularists in our country. And so not only did they not take into account their needs, they actually showed disdain for them. And that's what created this rage. So it's a complex evolution of 40 years of disdain that led to where we are. So, but I think there's no question that the moderate enlightenment and the aristocratic republic idea was that we can't trust people to make choices and rule because they will invariably follow strong-winded, strong-minded demagogues who don't always have the interests of the people in mind. That for sure was the moderate enlightenment view. And Madison in Federalist 10 argues against that by saying that, in fact, if there is a strong demagogue, he or she, what he was thinking he at the time, would be countered by other factions within, like in the country, that factions would wash each other out somehow. And there's some truth to that. I mean, we have factions that have balanced each other. That's true. But in where we are now, I think is a case where the aristocratic Republicans, people like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, and even a Madison and a Washington, they would be very worried about what Trump has done in terms of the way he's used politics. Absolutely.
It's a fascinating conversation when it comes to popularism, the pros and cons and the benefits and dangers, because demagogues can exploit that, but it lets the people in power know what the people really want.
That's right. And another question, by the way, you have to say though, here's if the populist movement is important in identifying what's wrong, populist movements don't have a great track record of how to fix it. See, this is the dilemma. This is you've cut. I mean, I appreciate this podcast because you've cut to the core of the dilemma, which is this: is that it's easy to criticize and point out that things are wrong. It's hard to design solutions to fix them. And this is the balance between like the elite and populist movements that you kind of the movement today between, let's say, Trumpism and elitism is a very much characterized by this same dimension. And I think, where I've come out is that both are important. I think you need qualified, educated people to design solutions. But when they don't work, you've got to throw the bastards out and elect others. So the electoral process is supposed to fix this. Now, unfortunately, for various reasons, and I think this is largely due to moneyed interests and corruption in some cases, but it hasn't addressed the woes of working class Americans very well and rural Americans very well. And we've allowed neoliberalism to push many of our jobs and our prosperity to China and India. For all these reasons, the elite solutions have not responded. And that's why I point out that Trump was right, in his initial quest. He was on to something big and still is in that sense. But at the end of the day, just complaining and rioting is not going to solve the problem. So then who is qualified to create solutions? And I think invariably it requires a certain level of education and competence to create government, right? And that's where, so I guess what I would say is there is a natural tension between elitism and let's call it popularism. And the magic of America, I think, has been to figure out how to balance the two.
That's a great point. When it comes to how to fix it, I think all we can really do is exercise our civic duty. I believe it is our duty to go and vote for who we believe is best suited to cater to those needs of the people and the popularism movement.
But can I go back to one example? Because I think it's so telling. We have a huge problem, as Trump has talked about it endlessly, at the border. We have a major immigration problem. Immigration is a very complex set of issues. It relates to security at the border. It relates to border control. It relates to the amnesty process. It's a whole bunch of stuff. So we've had 4 times now in the last 12 years a comprehensive reform package in Congress. We had one in January that, in fact, what can make the argument, it was a bipartisan solution. It was more tilted. It was led by, as you know, Langford. It had a lot of wishes that the Republicans had been advocating for a long time. So I think personally it was more tilted towards the Republican set of solutions, but it was a bipartisan solution. The fact that Trump insisted that be tabled is an example where, in some ways, I think we'd rather have the problem than solve it. We have to be willing to try to solve a problem as opposed to just using it as a political tool. And this is where I was very disappointed with my Republican colleagues when they let it go because Trump wanted the issue itself to be a hot topic for the political landscape this year. I mean, have you looked at the bipartisan proposal from the early part of the year?
I haven't looked into the package, no.
It's worth looking at because I think 5 years, 6, 7 years ago, it would have easily passed, but the Democrats wouldn't have supported it. So in many ways, the left came around. I mean, it had important elements of border security. It had quotas. I mean, they weren't called quotas, but they were real limits on immigration. The part that, of course, it also had, which infuriates some of the right, was it had a pathway to citizenship for Dreamers. Now, it wasn't an easy path. It required a demonstrable show of effort, but it was a pathway. So at the end of the day, I would ask you and your listeners: do we want to solve this problem, or do we want to keep just arguing about it? And that's where I think this idea of compromise is so important. So I just wanted to get that point in because these are not theoretical problems; they're real problems right on the ground.
So how do we fix that? What is the solution to this American schism?
The solution, I think, is demonstrated in our history. That is, at times when we've been divided, as this pendulum has swung back and forth, we've at times used what I call a secret sauce, a secret formula to move forward. And when we've managed to use these tools in the secret formula or the secret sauce, we've done pretty well. When we've abandoned them, like in the Civil War, we've had periods of terrible violence. So I think history has a lot to teach us. History can act as a salve for our wounds if we'd be willing to apply it. And to me, one of the dangers of where we are today, going back to a comment you made earlier, is not that we've never been divided, or maybe even that we haven't been more divided than this. The problem is that today, the elements of the secret sauce have been completely abandoned for various reasons, which I discuss at length and write about. But let me just, for your listeners, tell you what it is. I mean, what is this magic formula that I'm talking to? I think it's 3 elements, 3 very different elements. And I'm going to simplify for the purposes of our conversation. Of course, it's more complex, and I think, whether it's the book or my other writing goes into this in more detail. But to simplify the 3 things, the first one is a fundamental commitment, a willingness to operate in a problem-solving empirical mindset where data matters. If we don't agree and look at data, if we refuse what we used to call facts, we'll never solve the problem. And so the first thing is recognizing that empirical information matters, and there is a constitution of knowledge that we've built that's valuable. So this empirical problem-solving mindset, I would say, is the first one. And I'll go through all 3, and we can talk about any one of them. So that's been part of the secret sauce, having relying on a problem-solving framework based on reason and data. The second secret sauce element, what I sometimes call empathetic listening, but it's really the type of thing that we were talking about before with political debates or debate clubs. The idea of not giving just lip service to another point of view, but really understanding other points of view from the perspective of the reason and the facts that support it, like getting under the skin of other points of view. And unless we see today, it's too easy to demonize people who have another point of view and immediately hate them or call them the enemy. That's not helpful. The secret sauce requires us to really understand them and to be sympathetic in that way. And that's a tool that at times we've used and at times we've abandoned. The third one, by the way, and this is all the third element of the secret sauce, is an understanding going into the democratic process that by definition, for it to work, it requires compromise. And so you know up front that you won't get everything you want, but you can't let perfection be the enemy of the good. If you're not willing to not get everything you want, because invariably we have to compromise. Like going back to our example, the Constitution was a compromise. There were many people in that room that were abolitionists that didn't want to tolerate the lack of abolition of slavery. But to get it to move forward, they had to compromise. And I think that's the third part. So if we think about those three things, and I speak about this a lot, I think all three have become almost, completely rejected today. I don't think we operate in an empirical environment. I don't think we listen to each other in the way I think is required, and I don't think we're willing to compromise. So, so that's why I think the work that I've tried to do in my research, I think, is relevant because it shows there's a way to proceed here that's productive, but we seem stuck in this unproductive way of doing things. We don't let go of this kind of demonization and tribalism, as you've called it. And I think it's going to hurt us. I think we risk not being able to bestow this incredible democratic republic to our kids. And, despite all of our flaws, I do think that the democratic republic, our American history, is the best example of self-government in the history of the world. And I think we owe it to not only our children and the next generation, but to the planet and the world. We owe it to promulgate it, to continue it. And I think the only way is to think about those three elements. Now, maybe there are other elements as well, but I think those three are certainly worthy of thinking through.
100%. One of my favorite terms is radical empathy, and I think it's something we should always be striving for. Last question. What advice would you give to young people, the next generation of Americans, the Gen Zers such as myself, who are trying to be successful and navigate their place in today's political climate?
Well, this is a great question. And I speak to students often, young people. I think it's so important for young people to get a broader perspective on the fact that where we are today doesn't have to be where we go. It doesn't have to be our path forward in the following sense. I think both the extremes who speak the loudest and get the most airtime on the left and right are misguided. On the right side of the extreme, I think there's too much of a willingness to demonize and tribalize and reject facts. Actually, not take into account reality. On the extreme left side, there's a willingness to throw out all our institutions because it's not perfect and because we still have, um, uh, non-just systems in some ways. Things aren't perfectly just. There's a willingness to throw out the baby with the bathwater and break it all down, as you saw on campuses so often. I think both are really problematic. I think the idea is to embrace these three aspects of our secret sauce and engage in a way that can be different from the way we engage today. And that takes courage. It takes understanding. It takes a fortitude and resilience. And that's what I try to encourage young people to think about today.
100%. Seth, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join me on my podcast to help me flesh out and grapple with these deep philosophical and political ideas. Thank you for doing the work you're doing, illuminating these important issues. Keep it up.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Great to be here.